Good afternoon, and welcome everybody to the Wilson Center. My name is Eddie Acevedo, and I am the Chief of Staff here at the Center. Congress established the Wilson Center some 5 decades ago for the purpose, in their words, of strengthening the fruitful relation between the world of learning and the world of public affairs. We are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan. We are very much appreciative of the co-sponsors of today's event, our Latin America program, and our Hemisphere for Prosperity and Freedom series. Our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing options and recommendations for policymakers. With Russia's unprovoked war in Ukraine and the war between Hamas and Israel, it is incumbent upon all of us to not let this hemisphere be forgotten. As of January 2024, UNHCR estimates 6.3 million refugees from Ukraine. Then there's about another 5.3 million refugees from Syria. But in Venezuela alone, more than 7.7 million people have left. Venezuela is one of the largest refugee and humanitarian crises in the world, and it is not even a war zone compared to Ukraine and Syria. Instead, it is a man-made catastrophe for one reason: Nicolás Maduro and his brutal regime. The human rights situation in Venezuela continues to deteriorate, unfortunately. On January 23rd, the State Department condemned the arrest orders and detentions against at least 33 Venezuelans and stated that actions that run counter to the Barbados Agreement will have consequences. As of February 12th, Foro Penal estimates that there are 263 political prisoners in the country, and the regime just recently arrested human rights activist Rocio San Miguel. And sadly, the atrocities and human suffering remains. We are here today to examine the Barbados Agreement and discuss options on what policies could be considered for the future. But let us not forget that history has shown us, time and time again, that Maduro cannot be trusted, that Maduro does not uphold his commitments. In the past, many entities have tried to negotiate with a dictator and failed. Whether it was the Vatican, former Spanish Prime Minister Zapatero, Norway, Mexico, the OAS, the Lima Group, the list goes on and on for many years. And unfortunately, there's well-established precedents on Maduro's inability to negotiate in good faith, because he and his regime will do anything to stay in power. Maduro is weak and he is afraid. And that is why he is preventing María Corina Machado from running. But rest assured, this is more than just about power. It is also about money stemming from a criminal drug trafficking enterprise. In 2020, criminal charges were brought by the Department of Justice when they indicted Maduro for narco-terrorism and for running El Cartel de los Soles. And in 2017, Treasury designated one of Maduro's cronies, Tarek El-Assami, as a drug kingpin. From a geopolitical standpoint, Maduro has also welcomed and embraced our nation's adversaries, such as Cuba, Nicaragua, Iran, China, and North Korea. And even as we speak here today, Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov is visiting Maduro after a brief stop in Havana just yesterday. The international community needs to reaffirm its commitment to helping the people of Venezuela who are suffering under the yoke of Maduro's dictatorship. So with all that in mind, we have a lot to get to today. First, I am honored to welcome someone who really needs no introduction. He was a former Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement at State, former U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela, Colombia, and Chile, earned the rank of Career Ambassador, a distinguished fellow here at the Wilson Center, and I am also contractually obligated to mention that he is from the deep in the heart of Texas. Welcome, Ambassador Bill Brownfield.
Technically, Brady is the heart of Texas. I come from Lubbock, which is the Texas Panhandle, which is more like the head or brain of Texas. Dr. Acevedo, Dr. Lopez, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. May I advise all of you who have noticed several large red blotches on my forehead, that is not a contagious disease. I had the misfortune of visiting the dermatologist this morning, and that is what a head looks like after a pasty white person like myself visits the dermatologist for the annual appointment. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to set the scene, if you will, for any discussion that we have on matters related to the Barbados Agreement and next steps or even how we got there. We have far more expertise here on that matter, perhaps even out in the crowd. The Tylus Ambassador Whitaker or the Tide Ambassador Story to offer more concrete views. I will try to set the stage with 3 basic questions and then turn it over to the experts. Was it a good agreement? Is Mr. Maduro in compliance with the agreement? And next steps. First question, was it a good agreement? Ladies and gentlemen, we refer to it as the Barbados Agreement. The truth of the matter is most of it was negotiated months before the Barbados Accords, and it was negotiated in places such as Doha, I believe, Milan in Italy, and a few other places, and most of the negotiation was done by the government of Nicolás Maduro, plus representatives of the United States with European Union participation and Norwegian observation and nudging where required. What happened at Barbados, in a sense, was that the Democratic sector and their representatives were presented with a fait accompli and invited to sign on, which after some discussion is what they did. But one of the first rules of diplomacy, of course, is that if you do not bring parties into the negotiations, do not expect them to be robustly enthusiastic about the results of those negotiations. Part of what the Barbados Agreement did accomplish was, if you will, an exchange of prisoners, the release of all American citizens who were held unlawfully, in our opinion, by the government of Venezuela in exchange for a Colombian citizen who was facing money laundering and drug trafficking charges. And believe me, I, like everyone else in this room, celebrate the freedom for those prisoners who were unlawfully detained by the Venezuelan government. But ladies and gentlemen, for 70 years, the United States government has had a policy not to negotiate with hostage takers. Because to do so, the argument was, for 70 years, you merely encouraged them to seize more hostages and start the process all over again. We then must ask ourselves, as we assess this agreement, was this necessarily a completely good outcome? Third thought, one of the basic rules of diplomacy is negotiating is a give and take. You kind of give something in exchange for which you receive something. If, on the other hand, you give all of your leverage, like existing sanctions, in exchange for an ephemeral promise in the future, is that good negotiating or is that more questionable negotiating? And finally, the rule in negotiation is the tighter the agreement, the better it is because it is more enforceable. It is more difficult for people who are skilled at wriggling out of agreements, such as Nicolás Maduro and his experience over the last 11 years, to work his way around the little gaps, holes, or misunderstandings in a more loosely drafted agreement. Where do I come down on this agreement? I'll let the experts offer their views. I give them a C. I don't think it was a failure, but by the same token, I do not believe people will write books about this as a model for how an international agreement should be reached. Second, is Mr. Maduro in compliance? This one's a little bit easier to answer, although others are entitled to their own views. In its core, this agreement was quite simple. Sanctions relief in exchange for free democratic elections and the process leading up to them. Sanctions have been relieved. I mean, if anyone missed it, that the sanctions were lifted at the time of the signing of the Barbados Agreement. Let's take a look at what has happened on the other side of the equation. María Corina Machado was disqualified before the Barbados Agreement, at the time of the Barbados Agreement, and to this moment, and even worse, the government has stated she will not be allowed to run in this election. This would suggest that that issue was not complied with. There was to be the improvement of the environment for election campaigning, more, if you will, political prisoners released to be allowed to participate in the process. Since then, in case anyone has missed it, there have been arrests by the government that can only be described as political arrests by the dozens, and these all post-date the Barbados Accord. If you missed the message that I suggest to you Mr. Maduro is sending, you might note that last Friday, I believe, he ordered the UN Human Rights Commission's office in Venezuela, as Eddie has just pointed out, to get out of town, gave them 72 hours to hit the road, which they have so done. The campaign violence was to be controlled. It has gotten worse. Access to the media was to be granted. There is less access after Barbados than there was before. The election date was to be clear. There is no election date yet. There is a promise that there will be an election date set at some point, and a suggestion that it will be in 2024, which of course is good news, but perhaps not for the international observers, none of whom have been facilitated in terms of preparations to come to Venezuela in order to observe the elections. Ladies and gents, let me offer you my personal opinion. This is the only time I'm going to do it, ladies and gentlemen. It is my personal opinion that Nicolás Maduro will never comply with an agreement, any agreement, that would lead to his involuntary departure from office. Mr. Maduro, in my opinion, has calculated correctly that he would not win in a head-to-head confrontation with María Corina Machado. Therefore, he is now contemplating basically three options. One, force the Democratic sector to find some other candidate, perhaps a more controllable candidate, perhaps a candidate that he could intimidate, that he could conceivably defeat in an election. Two, allow an election to go forward but rig the results, which he has done before. And option number three, cancel, or as they would unquestionably say, postpone indefinitely the elections. I predict to you that one of those three will be what comes out of this process before this year is out. Third and final question, so what are the next steps? One step, obviously, is sanctions. And the U.S. government, the administration, has in fact announced that sanctions will be resumed, the ones that count at any rate on oil and gas, in the middle of April. Could it be earlier? Yes, of course it could be, but that's a tactical question. And I do believe we owe it to those who are responsible for managing this that they make the tactical calls so long as they stay on strategic point, and that is, since he is not in compliance, return to some form of sanctions. Second thought in terms of next steps is how to internationalize this to the extent possible. And this is worth a lot of further discussion, whether the United Nations, the UN Human Rights Commission, the OAS, NGOs, European governments, the Canadians. I honestly believe there's a lot more, now that there is attention on this issue, that governments and international organizations can and should be doing to encourage a democratic outcome in Venezuela. Third, the Lima Group. Some of you may remember it was the group of great promise in 2018, 2019, and it basically has faded away. It faded away, I would argue, as a result of electoral changes through much of Latin America, the old kind of, the return, if you will, of left-of-center governments in a lot of key countries, Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Chile at that particular point in time. Well, I would suggest to you that two things have changed. One, we are beginning to see some adjustments in that regard, and I take no position on that, but I just say it's a different package of governments now than perhaps 2 years or 3 years ago. And second, they have a new reality that they're dealing with in terms of Mr. Maduro's compliance with the Barbados Agreement. Time to resurrect something like the Lima Group, calling it something else, I offer that for thought and consideration. 4, the diaspora. Eddie figures 7.7 million. I've heard up to 8 million. It's a lot of Venezuelan citizens who are currently refugees in other countries. 2/3 of them are adults and presumably, therefore, are entitled to vote, constitutionally entitled to vote in Venezuelan elections. Now, some of you may have heard who watched the discussion that CSIS and Wilson hosted with María Corina Machado last week. She's heard that basically you're looking at maybe 300,000 to 400,000 that are registered, and the rest are not even registered. So over and above the complexity of them being able to vote in, presumably, for the most part, Maduro government-controlled consulates and embassies, how can you, they don't even have a chance to vote if they do not get themselves registered. Organize, organize, organize. I've been saying that to, among others, the gentleman seated to my immediate left. They're bored of hearing me say, we've got to organize, you have to organize the diaspora, but I would argue, once again, here's a concrete project. Organize them at least enough so they can vote if they are given that opportunity in the next election, if it in fact comes to happen. And finally, suggestion number 5 for consideration is, are there other ways by which we, the international community, individual governments and organizations, can find a way to support the individual that an overwhelming majority, that would be 93%, of the democratic sector, the so-called opposition movement, elected to be their representative in the 2024 elections. What more can be done? Is it money? It probably shouldn't be, unless she literally says this is what she wants, because she's under observation at all times. Is it more access or indirect access to the media? Is there ways to amplify her message through international media that in turn gets back into Venezuela? Is it more meetings, more engagement? Should we perhaps say that any democratic government in the world that sends official representatives to Venezuela who do not schedule meetings with Ms. Machado or somebody in her movement, shame on them. This is not, despite what we saw in a headline a couple of weeks ago, it's not all about the process. The process for selecting the opposition candidate is completed. She has been named. We're not going to argue more about the process. The question now is how to give her, if not a level playing field, at least a playing field that's not tilted 90 degrees, so she has to kind of climb up a vertical wall in order to get to conclusion. That wraps up, Dr. Lopez, what I have to say, except Dr. Acevedo said he wanted to hear Essequibo. I'll give you this in 15 seconds. Ladies and gentlemen, the Essequibo is a 125-year border dispute between Venezuela and Guyana. There are legal and historical reasons for this dispute, and they have been around for 125 years. But please, make no mistake. The current crisis has nothing to do with historical or legal reasons. It is a political ploy by Nicolás Maduro to advance and further his political interests in Venezuela. He actually has very little genuine support internationally, but beware the wolf when cornered. What nobody wants, I think even including him, is a genuine military confrontation brought on by a miscalculation over a political issue. That is my opening presentation. Dr. Acevedo, over to you.
Thank you, Bill, for those very insightful and educational comments. Next up, we're going to have a special video from His Excellency Iván Duque Márquez, former President of Colombia from 2018 through 2022, distinguished fellow here at the Center and chair of our Hemisphere for Prosperity and Freedom series.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be back again at the Woodrow Wilson Center in this Freedom and Prosperity Conversations in Latin America and the Caribbean. Today, the subject that we're going to discuss, once again, is related to Venezuela and the future of Venezuela. It is clear that Venezuela has been badly affected by the brutal dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro, and his only intention is to remain in power at the cost whatever it takes, as he has said it previously. United States and the international community have tried to bridge agreements between the democratic resistance and the dictatorship in order to allow the country to experience free elections that have not occurred in the last 20 years. So the question is, have those negotiations helped the Venezuelan people to experience the possibility of true elections? The response is no. Every concession that has been given to Nicolás Maduro, he has been using it to brutalize the opposition and the democratic resistance, and also to execute all type of atrocities against those who oppose him. As of today, María Corina Machado has now been allowed to become a formal candidate, although she was the winner of the democratic resistance consultation with a great amount of votes that provide her the legitimacy not only to be a candidate, but to become the next president of Venezuela. Nicolás Maduro, aware of the possibility that she has due to her empathy and leadership with the Venezuelan people, has blocked the possibility for her to run. And that is a major threat to any form of agreement that allows for free elections to occur. On the other hand, not only the democratic resistance has been banned of having the candidate to participate in the election, but we have seen recently some arrests without any guarantee from the judicial system that barely exists in Venezuela because it's fully under Maduro's control, of those persons who are close to María Corina that have been activists in the defense of democracy. We have seen, for example, that Venezuela has been able to enter again the international market in the oil production. And we have seen that Alex Saab, the money launderer of the dictator, has been going back to Venezuela in a gesture from the United States administration to open the scope for democratic elections to occur. But none of those gestures have turned into a real benefit to the Venezuelan people. So the question is, what is going to happen? Some might say that at the end of the day, Nicolás Maduro will grant the possibility to María Corina to run for office. And even if that occurs, having Maduro on the ballot is not any form of guarantee of free elections. Maduro should be banned of running because he's a criminal against humanity. He's been chased by International Criminal Court, and he has been indicted in the U.S. because of crimes related to drug trafficking. So having him on the ballot is no guarantee of free elections, even though María Corina could run if that eventuality occurs. But it's also assumed that she won't be allowed to run. It will be, again, a brutalization of the democratic system in Venezuela. So what should the international community do about these two difficult scenarios? I think number one is that sanctions should be implemented in a very decisive way. Red lines that are being moved so many times in so many ways are not benefiting the Venezuelan people at all. So real sanctions. And not only sanctions, again, against the dictatorship, but all the cronies of Nicolás Maduro are urgent. And at the same time, the International Criminal Court needs to prove that its existence is really worthy. For more than almost a decade, Nicolás Maduro has been accused before the ICC. Even myself, when I was a senator, accused Nicolás Maduro with the support of various members of the parliament in Chile and Colombia. And nothing has happened substantially since then, different than a formal investigation was triggered. We need the ICC to clearly move forward and sanction Maduro and justify its existence by accusing him and prosecuting him for the crimes he has committed over all these years. And we definitely want to see the whole international community clearly isolating that regime. For many years in the last decade, with the help of many countries, there was a recognition of the interim presidency of Juan Guaidó. And there was a lack of recognition to Nicolás Maduro for being the ruler of Venezuela. That gesture, which was a diplomatic isolation, was very important for the world to acknowledge everything that has happened in Venezuela. But so far, the legitimacy that has been provided to Maduro, or statements where it has been said that what matters is the process and not the candidate, are clearly producing a very negative, pessimistic sentiment in Latin America. We need to unify the defense of democracy and to unify the defense of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. We need to allow all the parliaments of democratic systems in the hemisphere to move forward accusing and sanctioning Nicolás Maduro and putting all the pressure that is required to have free elections, where María Corina Machado shall be allowed to be the candidate of the democratic resistance, and also that there is a finger pointing of the negative consequences of having Maduro on the ballot, since he's a criminal against humanity. What he wants is to have a puppet kind of election that he can manipulate it from the back and remain in power, regaining the legitimacy of being a president. And that simply cannot occur. So there are no simple answers to all the things that I've mentioned in this minute. But there's a clear demand that the defense of democracy, of liberty and prosperity requires no more concessions to Nicolás Maduro, and to effectively sanction his regime, him and his cronies, and to allow a real election in which we all recognize that the voice of María Corina Machado is the legitimate voice of those who have been resisting the brutality of one of the most negative dictatorships in the history of Latin America. Any form of dictatorship shall be rejected, but particularly this dictatorship that has embraced all the brutality possible in the minds of a human being to accumulate power and to exacerbate division, polarization, and the absence of access to opportunities to those in need. So I invite this debate at the Woodrow Wilson Center to take place, to think about what shall be the position of the United States of America in the months to come, and particularly what will be the statements that will be issued by both parties in Capitol Hill. Venezuela has to be a bipartisan effort, bicameral effort in defense of democracy. And there's no real defense of democracy if we don't really take sides in favor of the democratic resistance in the hands of María Corina Machado. So I invite you to enjoy this debate, to take sides in favor of the democratic resistance, and to promote, at all scale possible, the urgent need to re-embrace sanctions against Nicolás Maduro. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. President, for those important insights. Now let us get to our panel that are with us today. I'm honored to introduce our moderator, Leopoldo Lopez. Leopoldo is a global fellow here at the Wilson Center. He was mayor of Caracas for 2 terms and was then similarly disqualified, the same way that María Corina Machado was disqualified to run for the presidency. He has witnessed firsthand the brutality of the Maduro regime by being unjustly held either at Ramo Verde prison or under house arrest from 2014 to 2020. Leo, over to you.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Edis. Thank you, Ambassador Brownfield, President Duque. Thanks to all of you, and many thanks to the Wilson Center. So the idea is that we discuss the issue at hand, what to do next with the case of Venezuela, with a panel of experts. Let me introduce our panelists today, and I would like to thank all of them for joining us. So let me start by Manuel Ventura. Manuel Ventura Robles is a Costa Rican born. He was member and secretary of the Inter-American Human Rights Court that has its headquarters or its office or building in Costa Rica, in San Jose. And then he was also the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Costa Rica. So he will give us an insight of the legal grounding and what the inter-American system has to say with respect to this weaponization of the law, in the case of Venezuela, by disqualifying candidates. It's not the first time, but it's something that has been going on for many years in the case of Venezuela. Then we have Isabel Carlota Rovi. She's a Venezuelan attorney who is now working as an attorney at the RFK Human Rights Center, and she has been dedicated to following the case against Maduro at the International Criminal Court, and she will give us an update on how the case is being discussed at The Hague and the consequences that it can have. Then we have Mark Furstein. Mark Furstein was the Senior Director for Western Hemisphere from 2015 to 2017. He is currently at the Institute of Peace and also at the Albright Stonebridge Group. So let's start with you, Mark. I would start with the same question that Ambassador Brownfield addressed. Was the Barbados Agreement a good agreement? What would you do if you had your old position at the National Security Council today? What would you recommend President Biden to do given the process of the negotiations and the current state?
Great. Well, thanks so much, Leo. When I was coming in today, a gentleman said that he was here to hear from Leopoldo Lopez. And that's the same reason I'm here. So we should be switching places. Like, I think any non-Venezuelan who approaches the topic of Venezuela needs to do so with great humility. Those of us who have served in the U.S. government and other international actors have been grappling with, the Chavez government and the Maduro regime for a quarter century, and supporting the democratic cause in Venezuela. Obviously, to this date, without success, despite having our best and brightest on it, like Ambassador Whitaker, Ambassador Story, and even Bill Brownfield. But as President Duque said, there are no easy answers. That said, I think that there is an opening now for success that has not existed in some time. It is a narrow opening. It is narrowing, but I think it's still there. And I think it's important to underscore some of the policy successes that we've seen from the Biden administration the last few months. First, I think most important, the opposition presidential primary that took place in October would not have taken place were it not for U.S. diplomacy and the negotiations between the United States and the regime. And those are obviously of enormously significance and importance. As President Duque noted, María Corina's legitimacy is based on that primary. We also saw, as Bill Brownfield noted, the freeing of Americans. We saw a deportation agreement signed agreed to between the United States and Venezuela, though that is imperiled now. That said, obviously, there's been a lot of pretty serious setbacks the last few weeks, and we've heard the list of them from Bill and from President Duque: the inhabilitación of María Corina, the expelling of the UN, the detention of Rocio San Miguel and others, and an overall increasingly repressive environment. I think if there's one thing that gives me hope, though, it's the determination of the Venezuelan people. And we tend to talk about a lot of actors, the Biden administration, Maduro, the Colombians, Brazilians, et cetera, the opposition. And we seem to forget often the most important actors. And the most important actors, I think, are the Venezuelan people and the Venezuelan public. The views of Venezuelans are framing the parameters of action for all the other actors, whether it's the regime, the opposition, the U.S. government, and others. And if there's one thing that's clear, based on the polling, based on a visit I had an opportunity to make to Venezuela a few months back, is the commitment of the Venezuelan public to the electoral process, in spite of all the obstacles. And we saw that obviously in the primary, when 2.5 million people came out under very, very difficult circumstances to vote and overwhelmingly choose María Corina as the opposition representative. We know from polls as well that the Venezuelans believe that the electoral route is the best way to resolve the crisis in the country, again, even with all the obstacles that are very much understood. Venezuelans want to vote this year, and they are eager to vote. We know as well from polling that María Corina is by far the most popular political figure in the country. She has just separated herself over the last year from the rest of the pack. She would handily defeat Maduro if there were an election today, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what the conditions. More people will vote overwhelmingly for her than for Nicolás Maduro. And Venezuelans overwhelmingly believe that she has the right to run. At the same time, there's also a streak of pragmatism, and there is support for a so-called Plan B, that if for some reason María Corina is unable to run, what the Venezuelan voters would like to see is for her and for the Plataforma to designate an alternative candidate. I'm not offering that as a recommendation. I don't think that should be the position of the opposition or the U.S. government or anyone at this point. María Corina should have the right to run. That said, if it gets to a point where she's unable to, and she and the Plataforma decide to choose another candidate, designate another candidate, that would be met with overwhelming support from the Venezuelan public. There is very little support for an electoral boycott in the country. I think Venezuelans recognize how boycotts have failed to advance the democratic cause in the past. Now, as I noted, if there's an election day, the opposition is going to win handily, but election is not going to be sufficient to advance a democratic transition. And there will be a need for negotiations between the regime and the opposition on some sort of a transition pact. My understanding is the opposition is prepared to offer certain concessions, certain guarantees to the regime. María Corina and her advisors have implied as much publicly of late. Those would be painful. Those would be difficult. We're talking, about crimes against humanity and other horrors. But as we've seen in other countries and democratic transitions, those sorts of compromises are often necessary. I think there is a role for other countries to play in that process. Colombia, for example, I think can be a bridge between the opposition and the regime. I'm encouraged by the recent appointment of Luis Murillo as the foreign minister of Colombia. I think he has the skills to try to be helpful in this sense. And the U.S. government obviously has leverage, obviously has instruments they can use. Maduro faces numerous international threats. There's the bounty from the State Department. There are the indictments from the Department of Justice. And of course, and we'll hear more about this shortly, there's the investigation from the International Criminal Court. Something I think that Maduro, however, does not appreciate is that he is better off negotiating with María Corina than with someone more flojo. If he's looking for a sustainable agreement, for guarantees that will hold, I think only María Corina has the standing and political stature in Venezuela to negotiate an agreement and to sell it to the Venezuelan people and to sell it to Washington and to other international actors. She's the Nixon to China, if you will. I don't think anyone else in Venezuela in the opposition has the ability to do that. Now, obviously, if things fall apart, if Barbados falls apart, there will be a reimposition of sanctions. The U.S. administration has been clear on that. Venezuela will be further isolated again. I think that's a riskier route for Maduro. I think in that case, he's betting that repression can endure and that he can stay in office, indefinitely. But he would be proceeding under under that scenario without any guarantees. Now, nobody really wants sanctions to be reimposed. Obviously, the regime doesn't. The Venezuelan people don't, as we've seen in polling. There's some mixed views there, but they certainly don't want a reimposition of all the sanctions. Venezuelans, blame, as Eddie noted, Venezuelans blame Nicolás Maduro for the economic crisis, but they also believe the sanctions have exacerbated the economic calamity. The U.S. government obviously would prefer, I think, not to reimpose sanctions. And I think, it's important to keep in mind the genesis of the sanctions that we're talking about right now. They were seen during the Trump administration as the nuclear option. And there was a view at the time that if they were imposed, that Maduro would fall in a matter of days, in a matter of weeks. That didn't happen, of course. The sanctions were never intended to be in place for 5 years. But the Biden administration has been, very clear in public and private that the oil and gas license will not be renewed if there isn't more progress, if there isn't progress under the Barbados Accord. I think they might be looking at other potential sanctions as well that could be more effective and more targeted. But ultimately, it's up to the regime to avoid all this. In the meantime, I think the United States, we need to continue to support the efforts of Democrats on the ground in Venezuela and to take their lead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. So now let's listen to the remarks of Manuel Ventura, and particularly his perspective from the human rights.
Thank you very much. I am not going to read what I prepared. I'm just going to tell you some stories very important in relation with Venezuela. Before leaving the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in 2015, two judges, Eduardo Bio Rossi, who died in Chile recently, and myself, asked the court to present the non-compliance of Venezuela with 12, in those days, 12 judgments before we leave the court. And they approved it. It was difficult, but they approved it. So, after that, we were very clear that Venezuela, Maduro, was not going to comply with the judgments of the court, as I am very, very sure that he is not going to comply with the Barbados Agreement. That's impossible for a Marxist not to retain power in their hands. See the case of Nicaragua, it's the same. Ortega, he never will take a decision in that matter. We are receiving thousands of Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, thousands of them. And Costa Rica is a very small country. We have only a few people at 4 million of people, of Costa Ricans, and I think that there are around 1 million of Nicaraguan refugees in the country. And not all of them can find a job soon. So it's a really difficult situation. But it is the same case of Venezuela. It's a Marxist regime. Well, so responding to the question, he won't comply with the Barbados Agreement and with any other things unless he has to leave power. Let me tell you this now. Venezuela, with his resolutions, the inejecutabilidad, no compliance with las sentencias, judgments of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, give more hierarchy to the Venezuelan law, internal law, than the international law. You can remember that a few decades ago, when you studied international law, there was a discussion between professors or students that what was the case of the international law and the internal law. Some said that international law had more hierarchy than internal law, others the contrary. But after so many years, today, I suppose, that's what I thought, that the positions that the international law was above internal law was very clear, especially because of the resolution, the international jurisprudence for one side, and the doctrine for the other side. But all of a sudden, with these resolutions of the Venezuelan government, they decided that the international law was above, the internal law was above international law. Why? Because the international law judgment has to be they have to the international law has to comply with Venezuelan internal law. In this case, the Constitution. And of course, for them, you can remember very well what the concept a few years ago, I mean a few hundreds of years ago, of the concept of soberanía. This was a concept very different of what we have today. I'm not going to talk about this. But this is clear for the Venezuelan government and for Maduro. They have the power, legitimate power, to decide what they accept or not accept of the international courts. That's a problem that has to be dealt in the international community. You can remember that the judgments of the court are included in Article 65 of the American Convention on Human Rights. It says that the court has to present an annual report to the General Assembly of the OAS, and that must emphasize the cases where an state has not complied with the judgments of the court. Well, this was what we did in 1950. We request the court to send 12 cases saying that Venezuela has not complied with them. This is a large history, very long history, but let me tell you that to understand what is happening in the Organization of American States with this problem has to be, you have to read a vote that I presented in the case Caesar against Trinidad and Tobago, marriage reparation and costs. The judgment was from 11th of March 2005. I explained what is happening. The General Assembly of the OAS doesn't discuss the reports. When a court sends the cases to the General Assembly, doesn't discuss the problem. What they approve in the General Assembly is that what is decided by the political forum of the General Assembly, of the Permanent Council. This is what they discuss. And the political forum, what says, is that, political and juridical forums, is that the states had the obligation to comply with the judgments of the General Assembly, of the court, but they do not mention which is the state that has not complied with the judgment of the court. So nothing is going to happen. This is going to continue. It seems that for them, and they agree in this matter, all the states, they don't want to mention Venezuela because they don't want to be mentioned tomorrow in similar cases. So this is a problem that has to be resolved, of course. Read that vote. It's a little long, but it is very important for these cases. The two main cases in this matter of inexecutabilidad, enforceability of the judgment of the Inter-American Court are Leopoldo Lopez case, which was considered by the court in 2010, and the case of María Corina Machado now. But now Venezuela denounced the American Convention on Human Rights. I don't know if someday this case is going to be in the hands of the court. What you have to say, to do, is to read an article wrote a few years ago by Alan Brewer Carillas, which is a very distinguished jurist. He's a very, very, very intelligent lawyer of Venezuela that has been living in the last 12 or more years in New York. He has to leave Venezuela. The article is called, in Spanish, El ilegítimo control, vea cómo lo llama, ilegítimo control de constitucionalidad, control of constitutionality of the judgments of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights by the Sala Constitucional del Tribunal Supremo de Justicia de Venezuela. This case of the case of Leopoldo Lopez, I suppose that you know it very well, September 2011. This article was published in a book of homage to Antonio Torres del Moral, Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia, Madrid 212. All the arguments of the decisions of Venezuela regarding the non-compliance of judgments were considered in a very intelligent way and rejected by Alan Brewer Carillas. So that has to be in the hands of the people that is working with these cases. The other case, after the case of María Corina Machado and Leopoldo Lopez, is the case Petro Urrego, the president of Colombia today. In this case, the court has determined the international responsibility of the state of Colombia for the imposition of disciplinary sanctions and of the Petro, who was the alcalde mayor de Bogotá, that's the title, and said that he cannot occupy cargos publics for violation of the derecho, the judicial guarantees and political rights. Well, the case went to the court, and Petro won the case. In those days, I was not in the court, But I think that he established the guarantees that a resolution like this need to have to be approved by the organs of the Inter-American system. Let me try some more points. One of these is what the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights said regarding the case, after the case of María Corina Machado, because now the court has no jurisdiction over Venezuela, but the commission does. I'm sorry. The Venezuelan Supreme Court confirmed on January 26 the political disqualification from holding public office of the opposition presidential candidate. María Corina Machado, according to a ruling published on its web page. The highest Venezuelan court ratifies Machado's disqualification for a period of 15 years. Machado was elected as the unity candidate of the opposition, you know this very well, in an election held in October of last year. As a result of the recent events involving Mrs. Machado, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a statement on December 26, 1923, in which it rejected the measures adopted by the Venezuelan Public Prosecutor's Office aimed at hindering the participation of the opposition in the 2024 presidential elections. It urged the state to refrain from arbitrarily detaining opposition members, to release political prisoners, and to allow political participation on the equal conditions. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights reaffirmed that the Venezuelan justice system does not offer guarantees of independence and impartiality, and that it has played a significant role in the repression of government opponents. At the same time, it warns that the issue of extremely broad, vague, and ambitious criminal offenses, such as treason, can be used to persecute and impede legitimate political participation. This has been said by the court in many other cases.
We need to start concluding to go. Que tenemos que ir concluyendo para pasar al próximo panelista.
Okay, I'll finish soon. Previously, on December 2023, the Inter-American Commission followed up Resolution 29/2023 regarding the situation of María Corina Machado Parisca in Venezuela after analyzing the information, the available information, and identifying challenges in light of the lack of response of the states. Now, I have two recommendations, and I'll finish. Recommendations. Combat the disinformation through two channels. The disinformation produced by the declarations and official documents of the government of Venezuela. NGOs, because the courts cannot consider the case now, but the Commission is going to continue working on this. NGOs should report the veracity of the resolutions of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on disqualifications. And second, the international community must insistently publicize the reality of the facts against democratic institutions in Venezuela. These are my 2 recommendations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Manuel Ventura. Now we will hear from Isabel Carlota Rovi, again, a perspective from an international institution, the ICC. How will it apply to Maduro? And if you can make a comment around the issue of the Barbados Agreement that you also know very well.
Well, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me well. My name is Isabel, as you know, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. I guess I want to start by recalling that in June 2023, Pretrial Chamber 1 of the International Criminal Court issued its decision authorizing the resumption of the investigation by the Office of the Prosecutor on the Venezuelan Situation 1, citing reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity had been committed in the country. And I want to pause there for a minute, because I feel like we use the term crimes against humanity, ICC, fairly often, and it kind of gets devoid of meaning. But this essentially means that an international court found enough evidence that warrants the expenditure of international resources to determine if crimes against humanity were committed in Venezuela and who are the perpetrators. On March 1st, the ICC Appeals Chamber will be issuing its decision on the appeals that the state, as you know, filed. And I invite you all to watch it. It's going to be live streamed. And for the first time, the ICC is actually using Spanish as one of its languages. As you know, the ICC's languages are English and French, but because of this investigation, it's using Spanish and it's going to be translated. We are positive that it's going to be affirming the decision of the pretrial chamber, allowing for the investigation. We hope so. For those who don't know, I guess most of you do, but just in case, crimes against humanity mean the systematic or widespread attack against the civilian population. This means an official policy to attack innocent civilians. And these attacks can take the forms of acts of torture, enforced disappearance, sexual violence, persecution. And I want to use persecution, specifically political persecution, because I think it's important for this conversation. When we talk of political persecution, we're saying there is a grave or severe discrimination that denies the exercise of fundamental rights. It goes from the right to life, the right to live a life free of torture, to the right to be elected, the right to elect your public officials. When this is done on a widespread or systematic manner, it can amount to a crime against humanity. So what we see is, for instance, political persecution. We see torture for political reasons, arbitrary detention for political reasons, sexual violence for political reasons, and, well, political persecution in general. I believe that the authoritarian regime in Venezuela has been following 2 lines of political persecution. The first one I'm going to call today the civil death, and this is borrowing a term from my Guatemalan friends. And this essentially means the gradual, sometimes aggressive, but always consistent shrinking of civic space. It means the restriction of civil and political freedoms. And this can be done through different ways, barring, disqualifying political candidates, like it was your case, the case of María Corina Machado, Capriles, and many others, attacks against the independent press and independent media, and also attacks against civil society and NGOs particularly. And I want to pause there for a minute. Right now, we see that NGOs are being targeted through the enactment of laws, and I'll go there for a minute, but why NGOs? NGOs in Venezuela have been at the forefront of the documentation and denunciation of crimes against humanity and grave human rights abuses in the country. It is thanks to them, and I can't stress this enough, the heroic and titanic work that they do every day in a very hostile terrain to document human rights violations, to document the crimes that are occurring. It is thanks to them that we have an open investigation at the ICC, that we have a UN fact-finding mission that is focused entirely on documenting denouncing publicly what is happening in Venezuela. So of course they will become an enemy to an authoritarian regime. And what is an authoritarian regime going to do to neutralize them? Well, more or less keeping the formalities, because I do want to highlight as well that the authoritarian regime in Venezuela wants to keep some formalities. It does want to maintain some form of international recognition. It wants to have some international legitimacy, some economic incentive. It is going to import some practices that have worked for other authoritarian regimes. I'm going to give you an example. Russia in 2015 enacted an anti-NGO law that was called the Foreign Agent Law, and it banned hundreds of NGOs because it considered them a national threat. It was with a similar law that in 2021 it banned and criminalized the members of the Anti-Corruption Foundation created by Navalny. And several other countries with authoritarian trends follow suit. Hungary did the same in 2017, Poland, Nicaragua, of course. In 2020, Venezuela enacted a law justifying this law in the fight for terrorism and organized crime. It required NGOs to disclose their beneficiaries and donors. Just this past January, there have been renewed efforts to pass a new law that makes it very clear that it will criminalize NGOs, that foreign funding is going to be a crime, basically, and it is raising fears of persecution. Of course, the mere existence of this law, and I want to make it clear, even if it hasn't passed, the mere existence creates a chilling effect on civil society. It is a form of control, and it is, of course, contrary to an enabling environment to defend human rights. Now, just real quick, I want to pass to the second form of political persecution, that it is not exclusive. This can happen at the same time, but this second one, it's, well, obviously riskier, it's faster, but it's riskier, and it's more targeted. And I'm talking about the arbitrary detention, the torture, and enforced disappearance of human rights defenders, of activists, political leaders, or anyone perceived as a political dissident. International organizations, international NGOs, we have been documenting the structural patterns. This is a state policy, and there's not have any doubt about it. It's an official policy to persecute, to terrorize, and to repress anyone who is perceived as a political dissident. They're using the structures of the state, they're using state agents to arbitrarily detain and forcibly disappear, and in most cases torture this group of people. The pattern, you've seen it with the case of Rocio San Miguel. The person is arbitrarily detained, their whereabouts are unknown. The agents who carried out the detention say absolutely nothing about the whereabouts of the person, even when lawyers, friends, even when the family members are waiting, are at the site of detention or at the tribunal to verify the location, the psychological and physical well-being of the person. In the meantime, during this enforced disappearance, even if it is of short duration, the person is most likely tortured to coerce a confession or to coerce the incrimination of third people. This is a pattern that is documented. What is worse is that those responsible for investigating and punishing these grave human rights violations, meaning the judiciary, meaning the ombudsman office, meaning the office of the prosecutor, actually cover up and promote impunity. So much so that the UN fact-finding mission in its report in 2021 stated that the judicial power in Venezuela aids and abets the commission of grave human rights violations that in many cases may amount to crimes against humanity. And I'm saying all this as we have 263 political prisoners in Venezuela, according to Foro Penal, 19 of which are women. And I am sure that they can all attest to these patterns. And I think that any conversation we have about free and fair elections need to be done with that background in mind, because the civil society in Venezuela is being attacked and persecuted as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I know we've run over time, but if there is one or two questions, we can take them and then go to the closing session. Any questions? So if there are no questions, yes.
I just want to say one thing. I spent 37 years or more at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And I was one of the experts that raised the case to the International Criminal Court for the Secretary General of the OAS. I received all the Venezuelans that went to the OAS to testify. And let me tell you this. The cases that I heard of these Venezuelans are more worse than the ones that I saw in the court, in the International Court of Human Rights, during 37 years. More dangerous, more terrible, more whatever you can call it. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, and that gives way to a reality that we are facing. We are facing not with a regular regime, as we all know, it's a criminal regime. Many years ago, we were saying that this was the reality in Venezuela, and today we can say it with the backing of international institutions, with the ICC, with the Inter-American Human Rights Court, with the UN. It's been certified. It's been clear. The victims have spoken. Many thousands of victims have been heard at the OAS, at the International Criminal Court, at the ICC, at the UN. Bachelet went to Venezuela and she listened to hundreds of people talking about what was the reality. So we are dealing with a criminal regime, a regime that is managing the country with corrupt practices, and the economy is no longer, as we know, an oil economy, but it's a criminal economy, primarily led by drug trafficking, by the opaque dealing of the oil sector, by the negative extraction of gold and contraband. And that's a reality that we are dealing. So in terms of closing some of the comments that were made today, we are at a crossroads, and that was the beginning of the discussion today, and I think it's very clear that we are at a crossroads with many decisions to be made by different actors. So the Venezuelan people, the Venezuelan leadership will need to make decisions at this crossroad. It seems very clear that there is a strong leadership by María Corina Machado, recognized by the Venezuelan people and feared by Nicolás Maduro. That is why there will be obstacles down the road in terms of her possibility of actually registering for the election. However, it's at a crossroads as well for the international community, and particularly for the U.S. government that has engaged directly in negotiations with Maduro and will be in a position to decide what to do. April coming soon, and April will be, as we have heard today, an important month because that will be the time when the licenses will be up for renewal. So this will be the moment for the U.S. government to decide if they would continue to lift the sanctions that were lifted months ago, or sanctions would be reimposed. The U.S. government will have a menu of options because there are many licenses. There are the General License 44 that was approved some months ago, and then there's the license 41 and 42 that were approved more than a year ago that gave Chevron particularly and other companies the possibility to sell at full price the oil that is being extracted by Venezuela. But the decision is at a crossroads at the level of the U.S. government. We have also heard that sanctions, we've heard it from President Duque, from Ambassador Brownfield, from Mr. Ventura, that sanctions are a tool. However, I believe that it's also clear that sanctions should be rethought. It's not just imposing or not imposing sanctions, but to rethink about the most effective way in which sanctions could be imposed. So I believe that one conclusion is that the debate should not be about sanctions or not sanctions, but about what can be done with those tools in order to promote the expected outcome, which is a possibility for the Venezuelan people to vote in a free and a fair election. We have also heard from all of the panelists that it's very important that there is an international approach to the situation in Venezuela. Many times I have heard people say, and I hear it recently, that Maduro is isolated. I believe that that is a flawed understanding of global dynamics today. Maduro is not by any means isolated from the international community. he is strengthening his ties to part of the international community, primarily with the autocratic international community that has been, in my opinion, and I believe it was said today, the main pillar of support for Maduro, mainly from China, from Russia, from Iran, from Turkey, from Cuba. Maduro has received many different types of support. So on the other hand, the free world should figure out a way of coming together, and I think that that is one very clear recommendation from Ambassador Brownfield. It was said also by President Duque that not just the region, but also the democracies in Europe and United States and Canada should work together in order to have a common approach towards Venezuela. And finally, I think it's very clear from Mr. Ventura's and from Isabel's opinion that we need also to strengthen the international organizations that are set to analyze the human rights conditions and to do something about it. It is a sad reality to recognize that although there's been many decades since the Inter-American Court was established, it's not capable of enforcing, at least in the case of Venezuela, the decisions that have been made. And of course, a similar situation might be the situation facing the ICC. However, the facts are there. Now, it's not hearsay. We're not talking about political opinions. We're talking about facts about what is happening in Venezuela. And I would like to end with a comment made by Mark in terms of what we need to be hopeful about. And I share with him that the main reason why we need to be hopeful in the case of Venezuela is because the Venezuelan people are willing to continue to fight. And this has been shown over and over. The latest opportunity that the Venezuelan people were called to express their support to a democratic transition was October 22nd of last year, that against all odds and under all of the threats, the Venezuelan people went out to vote massively inside and outside Venezuela to support a candidate through a democratic process, practicing democracy in order to confront autocracy. So I believe that once again, the Venezuelan people surprised analysts, surprised those inside and outside Venezuela, because the Venezuelan people will not let go of their hopes to be free. So I would like to conclude by thanking all of you for coming, to thank all of our panelists. I will also want to inform you that we will be wrapping up this session with a two-pager that will be available to you with part of what was said today and the recommendations. And we will have different conversations about the situation in Venezuela, given that this is an important year, since there is an election that we don't know the date yet, that will take place accordingly to the Constitution and according to what Maduro has said. It should take place in 2024. We don't know when, we don't know the conditions, but we should follow the unfolding of the events in Venezuela, because as we know, what happens in Venezuela has had and will continue to have great impact in the region. So thank you to the Wilson Center, and keep tuned, because we will continue to inform with respect to Venezuela. Yes.